Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Thank you for being with us tonight. I'm sorry, I have a little technical issue here. Apologize. Anyway, thank you for being with us. Yesterday was the 164th anniversary of the surrender of Fort Sumter, the first battle of the Civil War, the bloodiest war in our history. The battle itself was not very bloody. As a matter of fact, the only people killed were 2 people killed during the ceremonial firing at the surrender. The Confederacy did fire the first shot. What led to that decision? Was that the excuse Lincoln was looking for? Did he provoke it, or was it Jefferson Davis that was to blame for this? We'll discuss that and more with our guest, Professor Jeffrey Addicott from St. Mary's University School of Law in San Antonio, Texas. Professor Addicott is a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, a full professor of law, and the director of the Warrior Defense Project at St. Mary's University School of Law. He was an active duty Army officer in the Judge Advocate General's Corps for 20 years and spent a quarter of that time as the senior legal advisor to the U.S. Army Special Forces. He's an internationally recognized authority on national security and terrorism law and has testified before Congress on a variety of legal and policy issues. He's a regular contributor to national and international media outlets, including Fox News, CNN, the BBC, New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, and has done over 5,000 interviews under his belt. He's also a prolific author, publishing over 100 books and articles, and is the author of Union Terror and the follow-up, Trampling Union Terror, both available on Amazon. Well, welcome back, and thank you for agreeing to come back on tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's get right to it. We're going to talk about decisions that both Lincoln and Davis made prior to Sumter and after, and let's get right to it. What are your thoughts on the interaction between the two camps prior to Sumter? And I don't think they actually were ever in the same room prior to Sumter, but there was definitely messengers in efforts made going back and forth. So I'd like to get started right there if we could.
Sure. Yeah, that was the American Civil War, and I put that in quotations, was one of the most horrific events in American history, and it still reverberates through time. And lots of discussions, lots of books have been written about various aspects of it. Of course, in our modern period, we have a lot of disinformation, in my opinion, about the causes of the war. And, most people think very sophomorically that the North fought to free the slaves and the South fought to defend slavery. If you're a historian worth your salt, you know that that's not accurate at all. And if you have any common sense, if you look at history through any type of lens, and I'm talking about any period of history, you follow the money. And basically that'll lead you to the truth. I always like Paul Harvey, where he said the truth is usually in the rest of the story.
Right.
And so one of my, I guess endeavors as a law professor and as a armchair historian, I always try to educate myself. As Mark Twain said, I never let my schooling get in the way of my education. And that's what you have to do. I mean, you really got to peel back the onion. And so the beginning of the Civil War, we'll just use that term, even though it's a misnomer, it has roots that are pretty deep. And I think one of the main causes, in my opinion, and the opinion of other scholars, is that it was about the tariffs. It's always about the money. Right. If you're a student of the Bible, of course, you know that the first king of the Hebrews was Saul, and then he was followed by David, and David was followed by Solomon. And when Solomon died, the 12 tribes went to his son, and they said, "What's your tax policy?" That's the first thing I want to know. And he said, "Well, my father collected taxes with a whip. I'm collecting taxes with a whip with little pieces of iron on the back of it. So he's going to increase the taxes against the advice of his cabinet." He listened to his other young men that grew up with him, and they just said, "Well, screw the people. We'll get more money." Well, what happened was 10 of the tribes immediately seceded and formed what's called the Northern Kingdom. And then you were left with the Southern Kingdom, which the capital was Jerusalem, with the new king, and he had the tribe of Benjamin and tribe of Judah with him. But the difference in that situation was you've got 10 tribes in the north with a new nation, and the original nation, of course, that's left was the Southern Kingdom with the capital of Jerusalem, 2 tribes. The two tribes aren't going to conquer the 10 tribes
Right.
because another axiom is that power hates to give up power. Power will not give up power. And that's just the way life is. If you're a historian, that's another truism in history. In the case I cited from the Bible, yeah, the Southern Kingdom hated to see the Northern Kingdom split out and go, but there's nothing they can do about it. Their army is smaller. Now, in the case of the American Civil War, the roots are deep. Well, again, we didn't have an income tax until very late in our history. We're coming up on 250 years. I know President Trump is talking about getting rid of the personal income tax. So if you didn't have a personal income tax in the 1800s, where'd you get your revenue to run the government? Well, it came through tariffs.
Yep.
And tariffs are basically charges, extra charges on a product. When a country ships something into our country, we would charge them more to sell their product here, which encourages local people to build products and people to buy from local distributors, American made, if you will. The South, of course, was the major exporter for the United States, and that was cotton. Cotton was king. The North made millions and millions of dollars off the export of slaves coming into harbors in the North and shipping them down to the South. The banks made millions of dollars off the slave trade. There's no question about it. So slavery was a sin, not unknown to most nations of the world throughout history, but it certainly wasn't a sin of the South. It was a sin of the entire corporate body, North and South. And a lot of people made a lot of money off the institution because you needed the slaves. Why? For the cotton. And it was manual labor enhanced by certain machines, the cotton gin, that made it more profitable. And so you have this tension here because most of the most of the money that came in the federal government came from these taxes. Yep. And it was the export of cotton. The North didn't export hardly anything. And then the money that came into the United States Treasury through the national tariffs was redirected primarily to the northern states, not to the southern states. Southern states were very upset, and they said, we're not getting our fair share of the revenue to spend in the South for roads and factories, whatever it is. And they were very dissatisfied. So you're bubbling up, and of course, slavery is an institution that good men in North and South recognized was an evil. The best men of the South always recognized it was an evil. And that includes George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Robert E. Lee. None of them would say, oh, slavery is a wonderful moral situation endorsed by the Bible. No, they would not say that. And so, but it was money. So you had individuals that did not have scruples. They just wanted the money, North and South. So you had this institution that grew, and you had slave states in the northern states. You had slave states in the southern states. But as tensions began to boil, because governments always need more money, and so tariffs are going to go up, which is disadvantageous to the South and advantageous to the North. And so in the election of 1860, you had the Republican Party, you had a split ticket. You actually had several candidates running, not just two. Lincoln's platform was the Morrill tariffs. I'm going to increase tariffs. Yep. Is basically one of his platforms. Southerners heard that and they said, oh, okay, we're not voting for you. And oh, by the way, if you get elected, we're out.
Well, and it was a pretty high percentage. Wasn't it like 47% or something crazy like that?
It was huge. It was huge. Yeah, it was huge. And so, again, people that are elected to Congress are usually the rich folks. And so the people that represented the southern states, most of them were slave owners. Because they were the rich plantation owners, and they had their own financial interest at heart. If you would have, again, the vast majority of Southerners did not own slaves, just like the vast majority of Northerners didn't own slaves, but the government was controlled by slave owners primarily, and what they call fire eaters. The fire eaters were those that were saying, what's wrong with this picture? We're not being treated fairly. We need to just form our own country. And this is an idea, of course, they said from the Constitution, we join voluntarily, we can leave voluntarily. And even Abraham Lincoln, if you study Lincoln, he confirmed that in the 1850s in some of his talks. He said, yeah, states have the right to secede. If the government doesn't serve them properly, they can provide notice and legally separate.
He said that as a congressman.
Oh, he's absolutely did.
Yep.
You quote him on that. He said a lot of things that people just conveniently overlook because they got the Lincoln that they've created out of whole cloth and the real Lincoln. So people pretty much recognized that, what was going on. And of course, election 1860, um, Lincoln was elected. He won the Electoral College, not the popular vote, but he was elected. And so you had a lot of people in the North. If you look at the newspapers at the time, they said, "Yeah, let him go.
Oh, yeah.
You do you. We're going to do us, as long as the South doesn't try to harm us economically too much." And so immediately you had seven, before Lincoln was sworn into office in February, you had seven states that had seceded. They had a provisional government set up. Jefferson Davis was nominated as provisional president in Montgomery, Alabama. They had opened up the Mississippi River so northern ships could do commerce, because in order to go north up the Mississippi, you got to go through the new Confederacy. And so they said, okay, we'll open that up. They also demanded that the various federal forts, you had several in Florida and one in South Carolina, that were still not surrendering to Confederate authorities. The most notable one was in Pensacola, Florida, and in Fort Sumter in the harbor of New York. And there's another fort on the coast there as well. And these people were still, holding out. Basically, most of the federal arsenals surrendered. Harper's Ferry here in Texas and San Antonio, they just pulled down the flag and they just went home. So things went pretty smoothly. Things were going around pretty well. And of course, Lincoln, though, back to our own axiom, power hates to give up power.
Right.
One of the defining things about the real Abraham Lincoln is that he wasn't going to let the Confederacy stand up as a new nation. There's no way. But he knew that many people in the North, it was very factious. He knew that many of them would not stand for war. And there was no federal army. There was no standing army. So, and the head of the Republican Party at that time was a fellow by the name of William Seward, who was also the Secretary of State. He viewed Lincoln as well-meaning but incompetent. It was kind of, you look at the early, he doesn't know what he's doing. He had a cabinet that was kind of split. The first question, was, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? President Buchanan, who was the lame duck president from December until Lincoln took over, he was inaugurated. He sent I think it was called the Star of the South, or the Star of the, I think what's the name of it? There was a relief ship, Star of the West, because the issue at Fort Sumter is you had 82 men in Charleston, South Carolina. And they were commanded by an individual that was married to a Georgian. I think he was from Kentucky, and his name was Anderson, Roger Anderson. And he had 82 men. He consolidated his forces on that little, off in the harbor there at Fort Sumter. 82 folks.
Well, they were originally in Fort Moultrie, and
Yes,
on his own initiative, he moved
right.
them to Sumter. Sumter wasn't even completed. It was still under construction.
You're absolutely right. And it was a brilliant move on his part from a military perspective. He said, look, we got to get a place at least where we got some distance between us and the enemy.
Right.
So he did that. But with an 82-man garrison, like you pointed out, you're not going to do too much. And without getting food, you're going to starve out. And Lincoln wanted to keep those federal properties because all along he wanted, his strategy was, I want to goad the South into firing the first shot so they will be deemed as the aggressors.
Right.
He said, there's no way we're going to be, I'm not going to be able to consolidate the North into a fighting unit unless I am able to goad them into firing the first shot. So they opened up a series of negotiations when President Buchanan was still in office. Lincoln continued those. Lincoln sent emissaries, down to South Carolina to talk to people and, to try to parlay and try to do what he could do. Again, the Star of the West was sent down under Buchanan. We fired a couple of shots at it. When I say we, the South, I'm a Southerner. They turned around and went back. That didn't bother anybody, North or South. No newspaper said, oh, the Southerners fired a shot at the Star of the West. War, war, war. No, there was no injuries, no nothing. They just said, we're not going to let you resupply them. And that was a big issue. And the South negotiated. Again, as I indicated, they said, we'll open up the Mississippi. In fact, they did open up the Mississippi for navigation. We just want to leave in peace. You do you, and we'll do us. And of course, President Lincoln had other things he had to contend with, a split cabinet about what to do. And then, of course, you had 7 southern states that had seceded, but things were kind of quiet. I mean, January, February, no shots fired. 2 months is a long time. And the upper South had stayed with the Union. As you know, and you pointed this out yourself, Virginia voted to stay in the Union. And the Virginia Congress stayed in session because they didn't trust Lincoln, basically. So they still stayed in session for a while. And the Upper South, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina were the most populous, Arkansas, other slave states, Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky.
Well, they weren't; those slave states weren't allowed to leave. I mean, Lincoln right away made sure Maryland and Kentucky were in no position to leave. That's
Yeah,
not to say they didn't provide troops to the South, but they couldn't secede.
that's right. He took steps, and also the legislature in Ohio was in the mind to secede. The governor wasn't, but the Ohioan legislature, if you look at that issue, he
Yeah.
also put the wrench in that one. But yeah, he did what he could to keep, the Upper South and other southern states, as you indicated, that had, they were slave states, but they weren't predominantly slave states. Neither was Virginia. Virginia was not a predominantly slave state relying on King Cotton. They had a lot of tobacco.
Right.
But so he was thinking, okay, the seven southern states down there, they don't have much. They've got they've got some capabilities, but they should be easy to defeat if we can get an army together. But his main thought was always, I want to goad them to firing the first shot. You have three forts in Florida that were still under Union control. One was at Key West, and then the other one, the significant one, was again in Pensacola, Florida, which was never turned over. Pensacola, Florida never fell. The other two in Florida fell. But it was either going to be Pensacola where the fight was going to start, or in Lincoln's mind, it was going to be Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter's closer, so that's what he was looking at. And so the negotiations went back and forth. There was a lot of deceit, a lot of confusion, though, as well. And but that was Lincoln's goal, is to do that. Different historians have different takes on it, but it was clear that his position all along was to get the South to fire the first shot. And even people in the South knew that that should be something that should never happen, because war is not just about bullets going downfield or downrange. It's a propaganda issue as well. And so this was a huge moment in time where Lincoln would either shine or he would not shine. And I think Seward underestimated him. And the South, of course, from their perspective, it actually was April the 8th that Lincoln sent down a formal letter saying down to Charleston, saying that we're going to resupply Fort Sumter.
Right.
Even though we had made promises and assurances we weren't really going to do that, we intend to do it, and it's on its way. And so they immediately telegraphed down to Montgomery, Alabama, President Davis, hey, the resupply ships are coming. It looks like something's going to happen, because we either got to fire shots to block them, but they're going to come right into the harbor, not like the Star of the West that didn't get that far, and we got to do something. And so the fleet was coming to resupply the fort. So Davis had a decision to make. Davis called together his cabinet. And I want to read you a quick quote. This is very fascinating. He assembled his cabinet and laid that telegram before them. And then the reactions were varied. Richard Toombs, who was a fire eater, was disturbed and said so. He said, quote, "The firing on the fort will inaugurate a civil war greater than any the world has yet seen, and I do not feel competent to advise you." He paced the room, lowered his head, hands clasped beneath his coattails. "Mr. President, at this time it is suicide, murder, and you will lose us every friend in the North. You will wantonly strike a hornet's nest which extends from mountain to ocean. Legions now quiet will swarm out and sting us to death. It is unnecessary. It puts us in the wrong. It is fatal." And he was right. Everybody knew that was the dumbest thing you could do, would be goaded into firing on Fort Sumter.
Well, let me ask this question.
You're the aggressor.
Let me play devil's advocate here on this. Okay, if you say you're a sovereign country, you cannot allow those Union boats in there to resupply. And if Lincoln was determined to go to South, wouldn't he have done it some other way if this one didn't go his way? If the South hadn't fired, wouldn't they wouldn't he have found another way to go to me? Because if you're claiming that you are now a sovereign country, and he's saying, no, you're still part of our country, and we're not going to, secession is illegal, which was his interpretation, certainly not the interpretation widespread north or south, but that was his interpretation. I mean, I can see it. Yeah, okay, it was not a smart thing, but was it avoidable? I mean,
well, I think, yeah, again, it's a what ifs of history. Davis reasoned as you did. We're a sovereign nation. We have to protect our sovereignty and like our border situation. If we have borders, we're a nation. We don't open borders, we're not a nation. What I would have advised is, again, it's a small fort. You can put some Confederate vessels out there, whatever you've got, surrounding the fort. Let the Union fire the first shots. Let them ram and kill some of your soldiers. Because, then the narrative is they fired the first shots. They're the aggressors. We're simply trying to cut a deal the best we can and make this thing go away. Or set up some type of blockade if you can, or again, if these relief ships come in, they're just coming in with food. Let them drop the food and then see what happens. But by no means do you fire the first shot, because it's a propaganda victory. And did it work? Oh, absolutely. I mean, overnight, the northern newspapers went to let them go to save the Union.
Right.
And so many people, and then Lincoln, of course, called for 75,000 soldiers to put down the rebellion. And
that was a bigger mistake than what Davis made in firing.
And that's Lincoln's blunder. And you're right about that, because Lincoln did a brilliant decision by getting Davis to fire first, but then he did a strategic blunder because he was very, adamant. He said, look, Virginia will never leave the Union. I don't care what we do. Doesn't matter, because they had already voted to stay. He said, they're not going to leave. I can call for 75,000 soldiers, do a quota from each state. They will never leave. They're the root of the United States of America. George Washington, all the founding fathers, all that stuff. He miscalculated, because a lot of his advisors said, you start this, you call for an army and demand that Virginia supply soldiers, and they'll go the other way. Lincoln didn't believe it. He didn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. And that's exactly what happened. He should have found some other way to gather a force together, maybe just have volunteers and not demand a quota from each state. In fact, Tennessee said, we're going to supply 50,000 soldiers to fight for the South. They viewed that as in violation of the Constitution, of the Compact, and even as a biblical principle, that you have the right to secede, but you don't have the right to use violence to force somebody to do something they don't want to do. Yeah. And so, as you correctly know, and we all know, that the Upper South seceded, which boosted the army and the strength of the Confederacy tenfold. Without Virginia, they wouldn't have lasted very long. Yep. And then, of course, the capital was transferred. Davis didn't want to transfer the capital to Richmond. And he was overruled, and they transferred it from Montgomery to Richmond. And he rode in. In fact, when he came in, they had a big carriage waiting for him with white horses to pull him into his new home in Richmond, Virginia. But yeah, you're correct. I mean, that was Lincoln's blunder, because if he would have found a way just to say, well, we're just taking volunteers. Any state can provide whatever you want to provide. And he should have couched it as, we're not going to go put down the rebellion. We're simply going to go, defend ourselves, and start in South Carolina, and then maybe do something, a little less drastic. But he put out a quota for every state to do it, and you will supply these soldiers. And the Upper South said, we will not supply these soldiers.
Well, and of course, he did that without congressional approval, for one thing. Secondly, I mentioned earlier that there was nobody killed in the battle.
No.
Just the only people that were killed, and there were two people unfortunately killed at the end of it during the celebration, during the ceremonial firing of the cannon. Something went off and some people were killed. That's it. I don't know what kind of injuries they were, but I'm kind of surprised that, since it was not a bloody affair, that everybody in the North was on board then. I would have thought that they would have said, well, okay, look, we didn't lose a lot of people. They weren't held prisoners. They let them go. So I don't know how they were able to I don't know why it was such good propaganda, being as there weren't high casualties.
Well, you're right. In fact, the people that were killed, it was a Union cannon that was fired by Major Anderson that killed his own people. It wasn't a Confederate cannon. The salute was by the Union side.
Right, right.
So yeah, but if you look at the drawings in Harper's Weekly, it's got all these big bombs coming out from the coast, and they did fire a lot of. They put a lot of lead on target. They just luckily didn't kill anybody, but there wasn't one or two shots. They opened up on them. I mean, they let them have everything they had.
Oh yeah.
There's that photo right there. I mean, they opened up, and that drawing was immediately put out in every paper, and they had fired the first shots. It was just a subscript that nobody got killed. They didn't care about that. The South had fired, they'd started the war, and that's what Lincoln wanted. He wasn't, he would be happy if they all died, but it worked because that's all they saw, and that's what newspapers sell. I mean, these things sell newspapers, and it ignited them. It wasn't free the slaves; it was preserve the Union.
Right.
And so away we went. But so that was a huge error, an error of arrogance on Davis's part, and an error of arrogance on Lincoln's part to think that Virginia would not secede and join the Confederacy because they stood by the principles of the Constitution. And I'm always amazed at the Gettysburg Address. They made us memorize it in school. I don't know if they still do. But if you really stop and think about it, it's like, what? Basically, what Lincoln was saying at the Gettysburg Address is, we got to dedicate the dead here, and we got to kill all these people so that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people will not perish from the land. You just described a government of the consent. That's a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It's a government of the consent.
Right.
The South didn't consent, so I got to kill you Southerners so we can have a government of the consent. What? It makes no sense, not even logically. It sounds good. 7 years ago, blah, blah, blah. But you cannot have a government of the consent when you point a bayonet at somebody. It's just like marriage. A marriage is a union of the consent. Does that mean you never have the right to leave? And if you do leave, I will shoot you. Well, if you're the husband, that's your position. I wouldn't go to sleep too much. Of course, it's a compact. It's a voluntary compact.
Yeah.
And you have the right to dissolve that when the conditions are no longer suitable for you.
Yeah.
Again, if you're a student of the Bible does not endorse revolution, but it does endorse secession. You have the right. In fact, our founding fathers said so in our secession from the British. When in the course of human events becomes necessary to break these bonds, here's our list of grievances, we're out.
Yeah.
But again, power hates to give up power. The British aren't going to let us go.
Right.
It took 6 years of war with the help of the French, and we won it. So that's why my initial example from the Bible, the Southern Kingdom didn't try to bring the Northern Kingdom back. They couldn't. They didn't have the army. All the soldiers were in the Northern Kingdom. But Lincoln had the bigger army, he had the bigger everything, and he had power lust. He was not going to let that money go. And so he was determined to do it.
I'm sorry, you mentioned the money. So from the time the secession started in December of 1860, South Carolina immediately seceded, and by February you had a confederacy.
Yep.
So by the time you get to March, April timeframe, you got a few months now, and one of the problems, it was not just, okay, we don't have the South to tariff anymore, but now we have another country to the south of us with ports that the rest of the world is going to come to because the South is going to have lower tariffs than we have. And do you know anything about what the economic impact that it had just in that short period of time in terms of from December to April, the loss of revenue for the federal government before Sumter?
Yeah, there was significant loss. I don't know how much, but of course the United States government went into massive debt to finance the war. You're right. I mean, that was another consideration. Now we got a competitor, and that's not good either. So it's about the money. There's no question that played into the formula. But again, the majority of Northerners, if you look at the sentiment, they were happy to let the South go and we'll work something out. And there was some thinking that this had happened before with northern states trying to secede and South Carolina trying to secede before, but they always came back. And there was hope that, we'll just cut a deal somehow. They will come back and we'll all, make this work out again. So at the time, it's easy to look back on it, but at the time, there was a whole different views on what should be done and what could be done. And but when the thing kicked off, I mean, it was bare knuckles all the way. But again, the huge error that Davis made, that was his first error. He made another bad error. But his worst error was you fired the first shot. Whatever happens, you don't fire the first shot. Let him come in, let him shoot at you, whatever it is. But you don't, you got to be self-defense. He didn't do that. Um,
You,
and
you,
of course, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
you mentioned that he could have done something different, that they could have maybe put some ships out there in the harbor to intersect, to keep them
Yeah.
from actually being resupplied. Or were there what options was he offered by his staff?
The cabinet,
Yes.
well, yeah. So the cabinet, as I quoted, one of them said, "Don't do it, don't do it." But you had people that said, "Do it. We're a sovereign nation, and we have the right to defend ourselves. The world will see it that way." Um, no, the world didn't see it that way. Plus, they were very upset that there was duplicity on the part of Lincoln in negotiating and said, "I'm not going to resupply." But then that's naive too. If you secede, you know that Lincoln is going to be deceptive. And of course, part of warfare is deception. Of course, you should believe his emissaries that he's going to do this and he's going to do that. Of course, he's not going to do that. You got to think, if you're going to win a war, you got to think like the enemy thinks. You got to think like Abe thinks.
Right.
And from all indications by his speech when he took the inauguration, he said, "I'm not giving up a single inch."
Yeah.
I got the quote somewhere here. He said, "I will hold, quote, I will hold all property and places belonging to the federal government." He said that in his inaugural
Yeah.
speech. The South heard that. That's his position. And so when they said, "Well, he's talking negotiations and stuff," of course he's lying. And that's what you do in war. You do things that are to the advantage of your side, and that's not morally wrong. Um, Again, I refer back to the Bible. When the Hebrews were coming in to take the city of Jericho, they sent in two spies, and Rahab, the harlot, I guess, she hid them in, up on the. She had a place up on the wall, so she hid them. And word got out that these two spies were in there scoping out the place. The king went up and asked Rahab, "Do you know anything about this?" She lied. She lied her butt off.
Yeah.
"Oh no, I don't know anything about it. Know anything about it." Is that a sin? No. She chose to identify herself with the Hebrew side,
Right.
and therefore all's fair in love and war. So no, she did not commit a sin. Oh, she lied. No, she didn't. She's engaging in subterfuge, but in warfare, that's perfectly acceptable. And she turned out to be one of the greats of the Bible. I think it's kind of tragic that people forever know her as
The
Rahab,
harlot.
because she
Yeah.
did some marvelous things. In fact, she even married one of these spies later on, and is in the lineage of Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you're naive if you think that, "Oh, we believe you. Yes, every day is gonna be fine." Of course not. If you want to have your freedom, you better be ready to fight for it, because power will not give up power. And Toombs understood that with the quote I gave. He said, "This is, you're unleashing the whirlwind. You don't do this, man. You don't put yourself out there, even though you are the good guys, as the bad guys, because the narrative is there. All the good things you do, and one bad thing, what do they remember?
Oh
Just the
yeah.
bad."
Yeah.
And so it was a huge blunder on the part of Davis and a brilliant move on the part of Lincoln.
So I'm kind of surprised that Toombs didn't have other based, and I'd never heard that quote before.
Yeah.
Believe it or not, I'd never heard that. But I'm surprised he didn't have something to offer. Hey, here's what we should do instead. Because
Yeah.
you can't go on indefinitely. I mean, the longer it goes on in that one place, the more likely something's going to go wrong.
Yeah.
And they'd already been
I
4 months into it at that point.
yeah, Lincoln's going to goad them as much as he can, but don't be goaded. It's like when you get in a fist fight with somebody, the law is you throw the first punch, they're going to arrest you. Even if somebody talks bad about your mama or whatever it is, that doesn't give you right to punch the person. Those are fighting words, but under the law, whoever throws the first punch, the cops are going to arrest you.
Right.
And then if you respond, well, you're acting in self-defense. So that was the narrative that Lincoln wanted, and he got it. He was a slick politician in that degree, but he blundered when he thought that Virginia would stay with him.
Yeah.
That was stupid because he was also warned that if you do this, Virginia will secede. And he said, "No, they'll never secede." He was very arrogant in that position.
Yeah.
But of course they did.
He was the railroad lawyer that railroaded us into a war, pretty much.
He was. And then, of course, as we discussed in our last podcast, when you graciously had me on, that when the war strategy went through, and in fact, I think I sent you a picture of Grant on a magazine called Signal, which is also very telling because this leads up to the second blunder. If we want to talk about another blunder that was committed. Uh, yeah, I mean, that's Ulysses S. Grant posing for the camera, 1864, the Battle of the Wilderness, I believe. And that's a Nazi magazine from 1944 called Signal. It looks like our Time Life magazines. You remember those in the old
Right.
days? They were
Yeah.
colorful, about the same size, a lot of colorful pictures in there, a lot of it's all propaganda.
Right.
But a huge article in there, complete with diagrams and maps, discussing Union war crimes. And this is only 80 years. This is 1944. The Union war crimes were 1864 when Sherman marched across Georgia and committed horrendous war crimes on women and children. So what Signal, which was printed in English, excuse me, it was printed in Spanish, French, and German. They published this magazines when the Allies were landing in France and sent it all through the occupied territories. And they said, look what the Americans did just 80 years ago to their own people, their own civilians, the rape, the murder, the burning down of homes. This is what you can expect. Do not trust them. Stay with us. The Germans will protect you from these evil people. And so this shows you that, these things have repercussions. Now, obviously, the Allies didn't engage in that type of activity on the, it wasn't command directed. We had bad soldiers that engaged in crimes, of course, but it wasn't command directed as it was during 1864 by Sherman, Lincoln, and Grant,
Right.
targeting civilians because the war was going badly. And I think I got another map there that kind of illustrates that too, if you can pull that up. Yeah, there it is. So, as we indicated last time, the papers in the East were very despondent in 1864. Even though people now look back and say, oh, Gettysburg was the turn of the war and the tide turns against Confederacy. Not at the time. At the time in the East, there was no, we've got them on the run, we're going to win the war. Not at all. It was a time when Northerners were ready to quit and we're done. We've lost too many hundreds of thousands of dead, not worth it. Now, things were going good in the West for the North, but all the newspapers are in the East.
Right.
And so all the public opinion is going on. So nobody really cares about the West. It's the East. So Lincoln, even as we know, wrote little notes to members of his cabinet, basically saying, I'm going to lose the election in November of 64 because things are it's a stalemate.
Right.
Grant stalemated in the East. And of course, Grant hatched a scheme with Lincoln's consent that I'm going to send Sherman to attack the main Confederate army, which was then in stationed around Dalton, Georgia, which, if you look at that map, just south of Chattanooga in the mountains there of Georgia is Dalton.
Yeah.
And so Sherman's going to go after Dalton with a huge army, and I'll go after Lee. So you'll see there's one railroad track that goes from Chattanooga, which is Union controlled, all the way down to Atlanta. And so that is the only supply route to get food because when the Northern Army came out of Chattanooga, over 100,000 soldiers, fully equipped with everything, the train went right with them. They walked along the railroad tracks. They got all the supplies they needed came right out of Chattanooga, right through Nashville, all the bullets, the beans, the supplies, everything. Northern Georgia, there's not many farms up there. There's not much food. You're not going to be able to live off the land of Northern Georgia. All Davis had to do is cut that railroad, obliterate the railroad, and Sherman would not have gotten to Atlanta before the elections. Wouldn't have happened. And he was urged to do it by Robert E. Lee urged him to do it. He was urged to do it by many people, including Wheeler, who is the cavalry officer for Johnston, who was the Confederate commander at Dalton. He was urged to do it by a lot of people. Just cut the line. In Mississippi, you had the legendary Nathan Bedford Forrest. His cavalry was there, and so he was urged, "Well, send Nathan Bedford to cut the supply line because Union soldiers can't move forward. They can't eat. You just blow up the supply line, cut it in several places, and it's a done deal. They'll have to go back." Um, and Davis wouldn't do it.
Why
He
wouldn't
would
he do
not.
it?
Well, one, he's from Mississippi. And where's Nathan Bedford Forrest? Mississippi. Who's protecting the state of Mississippi? Nathan Bedford Forrest. You take Forrest out of Mississippi, and oh well, yeah, you're going to have you're going to have Union terror raids coming in and devastating the people of Mississippi. But
Hmm.
but Forrest would cut that railroad, and the election of 1864 would go against Lincoln because there's no significant victory. They just raid a couple of towns here and there and do some atrocities on civilians like they've been doing. Sherman recognized that. That's why he sent several expeditions to keep um, um, Nathan Bedford Forrest in Mississippi, because in his mind he was saying, if I was Davis, I'd send Nathan Bedford to cut the railroad, because he expected that to happen.
Right.
It never happened. And then, of course, Johnston would not cut loose his cavalry under General Wheeler to go around and cut the railroad either. He wanted Davis to send Forrest, and he didn't like Davis. They had a personal grudge.
Ah,
He didn't like Johnston. And so here we go. Sherman broke into Atlanta. And of course, after the war, when Davis wrote his memoirs, he said, that was my greatest mistake, is not cutting the railroad. I realized it when it was too late. You think? I mean, a school child could figure that out. A school child. They gotta have you gotta have bullets and beans.
right.
And of course, when they got to Atlanta, then you're in the bread belt of Georgia. And so now you can pillage and rape and burn and go after all these farms that didn't own slaves and the plantations that did, and brutalize black Southerners and white Southerners. And that was an intentional strategy. But that was Davis's second huge error. And of course, he always fancied himself an equal with Robert E. Lee. I'm not a big Davis fan. Um, and he was very reluctant to appoint or to suggest that Lee should be the commander of all the Confederate forces. That wasn't done until it was too late in 1865. Lincoln did that for Grant in 1864, and he let Grant run all the strategy, which Grant did. Davis wouldn't give up. He wouldn't let Lee. He wouldn't. The Confederate Congress appointed him as the commander in chief in 65 when there's nothing left to command.
Right.
And then Davis signed the order doing that. Davis should have done that in 1863. Another error Davis made was when Lee went to Gettysburg. Davis held back some of Lee's best brigades of battle-hardened soldiers, Virginians. He wouldn't send them forward. North Carolinas, he wouldn't let them go with Lee. And that's the roll of the dice. You need every person to go with Lee into Gettysburg. He held them back around Richmond for the defense of Richmond, whatever that
Wow.
means. And he intentionally refused Lee some of his finest brigades. And a brigade, again, is about 5,000. So he held back at least 10 to 15,000 battle-hardened Confederate soldiers that had tasted nothing but victory under Robert E. Lee, kept them back around Richmond. Really? That's the roll of the dice. Well, it was a roll of the dice. But Lee knew that we're running out of resources. We've got to do a knockout blow in Gettysburg. So you're going to do the knockout blow, give Lee everything he needs to knock him out.
Right.
But he didn't. He did half measures, and Lee was not successful through a variety of other reasons. But as I say in my book, in both of my books, God controls history. As a Christian, this is the way it should have been. But we're just doing the what ifs, which is fun. But Lee even said that. He said, I'm perfectly satisfied the way it ended because God controls history. But at the time, and again, I always like to get into the time, people don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
As a Christian, we don't know what our future is, but we know who holds the future. We just do our duty. And Lee was all about duty. Lee knew that he was 100 times smarter than Davis as a commander, but he wasn't an arrogant person. He wasn't going to jump the chain of command and talk bad about Davis and demand this and demand that. He left it into the hands of God, basically. He said, I'm here, I'm doing my duty. But Davis made some tremendous blunders. He did some good things. I'm not, anti-Davis all the way. He had to organize an army
Yep.
and fly that army out of nothing. That was Davis. Davis is responsible for getting the country up and running, and he did a magnificent job logistically doing that. But he was not a battlefield commander, and yet he fancied himself as one, and that's the arrogance bone that got him.
Did he have any impact here in Tennessee? You know, Fort Donelson was Grant's first victory, and that's just
Yeah.
about 30 miles from here, if that. I'm here in Paris, and that's in Dover, closer to where I live. But there was another Johnson, I think Albert Sidney Johnson, I
Yes,
think.
that's right. Exactly.
And that was a lot more significant battle than a lot of people realize in the West. Like you say, initially the East got all the publicity because that's where the newspapers were. But overall, what they were able to, you know, the fact that the Union won those early battles there, and they were able to take control of the water and take control of a lot of the territory. Was Davis involved with that decision directly? Do you know if he had any play
No,
in that?
he didn't have his hands in that too much. We just had some lousy commanders that, didn't understand what was happening. And you only stay on the defense. You can go on the offense. But Albert Sidney Johnson, of course, he was killed at the Battle of Shiloh, but he was a brilliant commander, on a par with Robert E. Lee in my mind. He was shot in the foot, but as all good commanders, he just blew it off and just bled to death. But on the first day at Shiloh, I mean, they devastated Grant. I mean, they drove him back across the river. It was a brilliant attack maneuver by Albert Sidney Johnson. But of course, when he got killed, leadership matters. And, the Yankees were resupplied and they took the initiative on and then ultimately won the Battle of Shiloh. But the first day, it was an embarrassing disaster. They were almost completely wiped out, and they would have been, if, in my opinion, if Albert Sidney Johnson hadn't been killed.
So, what are some of the other blunders that Lincoln made late? Obviously, they ultimately won, but they always had the numbers. They always had the material.
The biggest, one big blunder that he made is he's the commander in chief. So yes, you appoint Grant to be your senior general, but when Atlanta fell, you've got an army of 100,000 soldiers. Hood took the remnants, as you know, went up into Tennessee, and I don't want to use any bad words on the podcast here, but he destroyed the army of Tennessee through just blunder after blunder after blunder. He was promoted way beyond his capability, and that's another blunder that Davis made, promoting Hood and firing Johnston right outside the Battle of Atlanta, and against Lee's advice. Lee said, "Do not appoint Hood. He's a good division commander, brigade commander, but he doesn't have what it takes to run an army." Davis did it anyway because he knew better than Lee. And of course, Hood destroyed the army. Absolutely. His plans were good, but his execution was horrible, absolutely horrible. And he just, was destroyed it. I know some historians don't agree with that perspective, but I think there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. So I'm not going to go into what his maneuvers were, but they were look good on paper, but in the execution, marching an army through Atlanta at night and trying to get around the enemy and do this and do that, come on, man. And then when you attack Sherman's exposed three armies, you attack the largest of the three, really? You attack the smallest of the three. So, a lot of it's just communications, the fog of war, but Lee was correct, in my opinion. He was promoted beyond his capability. Davis didn't listen to Lee's advice, did it anyway. But anyway, when Hood skedaddled into Tennessee, you've got a gigantic army. This is September. You still got October, November before it really starts getting cold in the middle of November up north. Grant is now in a stalemate with Lee, trench warfare starting around September. They settle down to a trench warfare. Well, all you got to do is have, instead of Sherman marching out of Atlanta that winter, destroying Southerners and murdering and pillaging and burning down homes, just have Sherman go up the back door to Richmond. Grant's here at the front door. Sherman comes out the back door. War's over before Christmas. Everybody knew it. Lincoln knew it. Lincoln used to sit at the telegraph office. He was always very micromanaging things.
Right.
He knew, and Grant knew it. Why didn't they do it? Because Grant didn't want to share the glory. Grant wanted to be president. All these power-hungry people, they're always looking for the BBD, the bigger and better deal. You're a one-star, you want to be a two-star. You're a two-star, you're angling, how do I be a three-star? They were all seeing presidential aspiration from Custer. All of them were. Same with Sherman.
Yeah.
But see, if Grant allowed Sherman to come up the back door and end the war, well, Sherman might be the next president. I don't I don't get the glory. I have to share it with Sherman. In fact, Sherman will probably get the glory because I've been fighting Lee all these months and I can't crack him. It was Sherman that cracked him from the backside. Can't have that.
I
And
never,
so
never thought
Grant,
about that.
oh yeah, the war would have been over. Lee has a scarecrow army. He was barely holding on. And all you got to do is just march him straight up there to the back door. Who's going to stop you? There's nobody there to stop you. Hood's in Tennessee. He can't get there if he wanted to.
So that's,
And
you said September. So from
yeah,
September to April.
oh yeah, the war lasted that long because of the incompetence of Lincoln and the ego of Grant. Lincoln could have overruled and said, "Look, great, Atlanta's fallen. I want you now to send Sherman. Don't you think this is a good idea to end the war, stop the suffering?" Of course, it's a good idea. Make it happen. You've got several months of warm weather. Resupply the army. Oh, they're too tired. Well, they weren't too tired to march across Georgia and pillage and burn. They could have. It could have been done. It could have been done. In fact, as soon as you see that Sherman is marching up to the back door of Richmond, Lee's got to leave
Right.
because he knows he can't sustain a two-front war where he's, outnumbered 3 to 4 to 1. He would have to abandon the trenches around Richmond and either surrender or head out west. He had no choice. He'd be outmaneuvered. So again, from a military perspective, and you're a military mind, you understand that. I mean, it's a done deal, but they wouldn't do it.
Hmm.
And again, I attribute it to ego lust, power lust, and just pure hatred.
And I'm
And
kind of
even,
surprised that, not that I have a high opinion of Lincoln, but I'm kind of surprised that he allowed it, because the longer you allow it to go on, the more potential there is for something to, go wrong that's going to affect you in the election. Wait a minute. The elections were earlier. They weren't in November of that year,
the
were they?
election, no, they were in November. But see, this is September when Atlanta fell, and all the newspapers saw the light at the tunnel. It,
Okay.
it was Lincoln knew he had won
Right.
because they were saying, "Oh, now we see the main army in the South is collapsed.
Yeah.
It's just Robert E. Lee left." And they all anticipated that Sherman would just march out the back door. That's what they were kind of looking for. They said it's over. And but see, Grant wouldn't have it because it would diminish his chances to be president
And
or
Lincoln
vice.
allowed it.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Lincoln was a weasel. There's no doubt about it. I mean, just the northern prison camps, as you know, Camp Douglas. Lincoln knew all about the starvation,
Yeah.
intentional starvation in the South. At least the Southerners could say the guards got the same food as the prisoners.
Right.
We can't even feed our own men. In the North, no, they had plenty of food and supplies. They intentionally starved and malnourished and mistreated Southern prisoners so that the death rate was almost the same in Northern camps than Southern camps. And somehow the Lincoln historians, oh, Lincoln didn't know about that. Yes, he did. Lincoln was a micromanager. He knew everything. He was very anxious to sit at the telegraph office day and night for any bit of news that would occur. Of course, he knew about it. But they intentionally starved Southerners at Point Lookout in Maryland and in Delaware and all these and Ohio, these other prison camps, just for pure evil. And Lincoln knew about it. They had the food and the supplies to give these people. They wouldn't do it.
Wow. But everybody thinks he's Saint Abraham somehow.
Well, as I often quip, Lincoln's the only person that became a Christian after he died. A lot of people can use the God word, but if you read all his writings, there's nothing in there whatsoever about basic Christianity 101. If you read Lee's letters, it's like every other letter. Saved by faith alone in Christ alone, I'm a poor sinner. Lincoln, nah, he was a humanist, as his wife said, and his friends knew him. He was not a Christian,
Right. Right.
as far as I know. I mean, I'm not God, I don't know, but I can't discover that from his writings. From Lee's writings, that's a no-brainer. You see it everywhere. Lincoln, he wrote a lot of stuff. He used the God word a lot, but
Well, he knew
anybody
how
can.
to use it as a politician. So,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
any closing thoughts?
Uh, the two books I've got, Union Terror and Trampling Union Terror. If you have to buy, and again,
Yeah,
even
absolutely.
if I didn't write these books, I'd recommend them highly. Union Terror, Trample Union Terror. I've been researching these books for almost 50 years since I was 18
Oh,
in
wow.
between life. So they're crammed with footnotes, and I dare anyone to contradict the facts and figures that I've got out in Union Terror. You can't. And so what I do is I attack all the justifications that historians, quote unquote, give for what Lincoln, Grant, and Sherman did. Even so-called conservative historians like Victor Hansen, that's on, you
Yeah.
know, different shows. Oh
VD,
yeah,
VDH, very distorted history.
oh yeah, he's a
Yeah.
Lincoln. He's a Sherman lover. He calls him a liberator. He ignores all the atrocities that he did because, well, the end justifies the means, I guess is what he's trying to say. No, it doesn't. A right thing has to be done in a right way, or it's wrong, Victor David Hansen.
Yeah.
So yeah, so a lot of people that should know better, and they know in their heart that they're full of it. And then, of course, a lot of the historians that are so-called historians that do not want to see the truth about many aspects of good old Abraham Lincoln, and they make up a mythology, and of course they adopt the mythology because it suits their narrative of the evil Southern and the virtuous Northerner.
Right. Right. Well, I'm hoping that more and more people will see through that. 'Cause, I mean, I do think it's important because that not only for recognizing the things that were done wrong in that war, but the whole premise of our country in
Yeah.
terms of our founding. The South was more in line with what the founders would have never accepted a constitution that, oh, okay, look, understand, once you join this union, you can never leave. They would not have accepted a Hotel California type constitution that you're stuck here.
No, that's true. They would not. And of course, it's a God-given right. So yes, the Supreme Court ruled in a Texas case after the war that no state can secede. That means nothing. It's a God-given right, and that's what our founders said. We don't care what the British Crown Court says. It's a God-given right. It's an inalienable right. So, as a constitutional scholar, I respect the Supreme Court, but I beg your pardon, there is a court that's above you. It's called God. Now, I don't advocate for secession, but I'm just pointing that out to people that wonder. They condemn the South for seceding, but they praise the United States for seceding from Britain. You can't have it both ways. Either they're both
Right.
wrong or they're both right.
Right. Well, in the South, the states were already at that time they were recognized sovereign states. The
Yes, they were.
colonies, the colonies were not sovereign. They were. I mean, they broke away from England. They were not
Yeah,
sovereign in
well,
terms of each individual colony. So
that's right.
you had really the South had more justification as sovereign nations than what our colonists had. Now, I'm glad our colonists said, you know what? We're going to do what's right, regardless of what the
Yeah.
king says or regardless of what Parliament says. But I don't. I'm like you. I don't understand how there's that disconnect to where it was okay for the founding generation, but then when the South wanted to be independent, oh well, no, you can't do that.
Well, the retort would be, well, the Confederacy had slaves. So did the United States. When they seceded from Britain, there was a slave state, there was a slave nation. So that's not a good excuse.
Yeah,
Slavery is an evil. And as I said in my book, again, these books, they're succinct. They're great retorts to people that come up with all this nonsense, and they're very reasonably priced.
yeah.
I would highly recommend it if you really want to see the other side of the coin, which in my opinion, it lays it pretty clear. But why is it important, as you indicated? The Signal magazine I just showed you. Our reputation was tarnished, and our enemies used that propaganda, which is what they said in Signal is all true about what the Yankees did. Well, there was no falsehood in it. They just twisted. So these are lessons we need to learn as a nation that points, approaching 250 years on our anniversary.
Yeah.
The end doesn't justify the means. We do the right thing in a right way when we conduct warfare. This is not us. This is an aberration, what occurred in the Lincoln administration.
Yeah. And I've read Union Terror, and it's an excellent book. I haven't read the other yet, but I'm looking forward to it, and I know it'll be. You said it's got even more details than the first one, so that's I'm
I
looking
like it
forward to
better.
that.
I like it better.
Well, hey, thanks for coming on, and thanks for all you do. Definitely have you back. I do want to have you back sometime and talk about the foundation you were the Warrior Project that you
Yes,
worked
Warrior
on.
Defense Project. Yes, absolutely. I would love to do it. And thank you for your service, by the way. I know you're an Army veteran as I am.
Well, thank you, and appreciate yours, and appreciate what you're still doing. And I want to thank the audience for taking the time to watch our program tonight. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support. Check out our audio podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms as well. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at our website, tninformer.com. Find and follow us on X and Facebook. I've got an announcement for this Friday from the Murray County GOP, their Reagan-Trump dinner. It's April 25th, 5:30 p.m. It's located at the Farm at Riverbend, 4792 Morrill Road in Williamsport, Tennessee. Tickets are $100. Just go to the Murray County, Tennessee GOP website for more details. Our guest next week will be Independent Institute Research Fellow William J. Watkins Jr., author of Crossroads for Liberty, and he's also written numerous articles in various conservative publications. We'll also discuss his recent article, Time to Topple the 14th Amendment. Hope you'll join us again next week. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.